Hello, and welcome back to the Thrilling Sound Podcast. My name is Sawyer, and today we're going to be talking about a little bit of communication theory, but also how it applies to ourselves and, of course, the Walt Disney Company. I'm excited. Let's get into it. To set the scene for you a little bit, if you don't know the history of Disneyland, well, I'm about to tell you. Walt Disney used to take his two daughters on a daddy-daughter date pretty regularly. One day, he decided to take them to the Griffith Park Carousel. And while he took them to the carousel, they were having so much fun, and he was just sitting there, eating his popcorn on his bench, and he was thinking, wow, am I bored? So, he decided to build Disneyland so that parents and children can both enjoy their trips out. Walt started doing this thinking from the early to mid 1950s. They started construction on Disneyland in 1954, so you can kind of see where the timeline is. For Disneyland, Walt was inspired by the theater. He wanted to make sure that his guests felt immersed in the stories as well, so that, the adults would be entertained. He also wanted to make sure that his employees that worked at the park understood that they were a part of the story. They were not employees. No, they were cast members. They were not engineers. They were not merchandise clerks. They were all cast members. They didn't have jobs. They had roles. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore costumes. It was all a ploy to make sure that everybody understood they were in the story, from guests to employees to Walt himself. As you can see, Disneyland was a great success, and now they have parks spanning all the continents and all around the world, and they even have cruise lines. It was very successful. Around the same time, 1956, Erving Goffman was actually creating his own theory of how people communicate, and this theory was also inspired by the theater. Goffman was specifically inspired by the front stage and backstage parts of the theater. The front stage is the show. That's what the audience is supposed to see. That's where the audience is going to get mesmerized. But the backstage, some would argue that's where the true magic happened, but others would argue that's where the nitty and gritty things of life came through. You didn't see the beautiful castle. You saw the sweaty guy pushing the castle from the back. Goffman applied this to how people communicate. Here's a quote from him. There's a popular view that the individual offers his performance and puts on his show for the benefit of other people. That means that every time you interact with somebody, you're being fake. You're putting on a show. You're not being authentic. You're tailoring everything that you say, the way that you say everything, to make sure that that person is understanding what you're saying and why you're saying it, essentially, so that they understand you. You could argue that Disneyland, and for that matter, theme parks in general, are doing the same thing. They are tailoring the experience that you will experience from them so that you will enjoy it and you will continue to come back and spend your money. And, for me personally, as a theme park fan, I believe it is to my benefit. I would hope that it's to your benefit too. Goffman goes on to say, at one extreme, we find that the performer can be fully taken in by his own act. He can be sincerely convinced that the impression of reality which he stages is the real reality. And I know that I can relate to that. When I walk into the deck for a Drexel intramural game, I want to look like an athlete. I want to look strong. I want to look intimidating. But in reality, I'm 5'4". But during that period where I'm trying to look intimidating and, I'm dribbling that basketball and making shots and looking around all cool, it's almost like I believe that I am 6'4" and Joel Embiid or whatever, you get the point. It's almost to convince my own self that I can be that athlete and that others can perceive me as that athlete, and then when we're on the floor, that we can communicate to each other as athletes. And I think, honestly, you could apply that to Disneyland. You could even apply that to the cast members and or employees that are portraying those roles that they're portraying. If you talk to somebody, especially at Disneyland because of the tradition, if you talk to a cast member who is in their role, let's say you're going to talk to somebody who is operating the Mine Train roller coaster in Frontierland. If you talk to them, they're going to talk to you like a cowboy. And they honestly might even believe they are a cowboy for that instance. And especially if there's a child present, they are going to believe that that cast member who's going to go home to their suburban LA apartment is actually a cowboy in the 1800s. Welcome back to the Thrilling Sound Podcast. My name is Sawyer, and today we are still discussing communication theory, especially Goffman's front stage and backstage theory, and how it applies to our everyday life, and of course, everybody's favorite, Walt Disney World and/or Disneyland and/or whatever you want, the Walt Disney Company, especially the parks. Here's another Goffman quote for you. When the individual has no belief in his own act and no ultimate concern with the beliefs of his audience, we may call him cynical, reserving the term sincere for individuals who believe in the impression fostered by their own performance. It should be understood that the cynic, with all his professional disinvolvement, may obtain unprofessional pleasures from his masquerade, experiencing a kind of gleeful spiritual aggression from the fact that he can toy at will with something his audience must take seriously. Now that is a lot, but I believe that we can pinpoint exactly what Goffman was trying to say here. My interpretation is that some people enjoy being critical of things that people sometimes get joy from. Think about it in your own life. Do you have somebody that's like really into Harry Potter and somebody will come in and be like, that's all fake, right? And they kind of do it with like a smile. And that other person is sad and you're kind of thinking, why would you do that? Well, maybe, it's a trauma mechanism, whatever. But they do it almost gleefully. And I think a lot of people look at Disneyland the same way. Now, you can definitely come to Disneyland and think, wow, this is capitalistic hell. Everything is overpriced. Everything is ideology almost for a mouse, a cartoon mouse. I get it. I do get it. But there are certain people, and I'm not saying this is everybody, but there are certain people who kind of enjoy to quote unquote break the magic. I think a lot of this might be boiled down to like teenage boys, 13-year-old boys. If you go on a vacation with a 13-year-old boy, good luck. But a lot of them are like, oh, you're not the real Cinderella. And that poor cast member who is playing Cinderella has to, brush it off, even though she knows and the boys know, of course she's not the real Cinderella because there's not a real Cinderella. However, according to Goffman, that Cinderella can believe that she is Cinderella in that moment. And some could argue that is real, but of course the cynic is not going to. In that scenario we just witnessed, we saw the cycle of disbelief to belief and vice versa. And that's a cycle that I don't think a lot of people talk about. I think we often put people into boxes and say, oh, they're a cynic, or, oh, their head's in the clouds. They're not on Earth. They're not in our reality. But I think the majority of us can cycle from belief to disbelief and belief and disbelief again and again. I think of my own self. As a child, I was mesmerized by the Magic Kingdom. I thought everything was real. And then when I got older, I was like kind of sad. I was like, oh, this is some people from Central Florida just putting on a show for us. But then I really started to thinking about the engineering and the time and the commitment that these people, these cast members, these Imagineers put into these parks, and the magic was back again. Now, it wasn't back in the original form, no, but the cycle was complete. Now, let's get into the real meat of this theory. Let's talk about front stage. Here's a direct quote from Goffman. First, there's a setting involving furniture, decor, physical layout, and other background items which supply the scenery and stage props for the spate of human action played out before, within, or upon it. Now think to your own life how this might be applied. If we're putting on a show in communication, I tend to think of a classroom, like you get into that space and you feel like you're ready to get lectured to. You're sitting in a wooden chair, in a wooden desk, you're looking at a chalkboard with chalk written on it. Maybe there's some notes from the previous class. You've got your notebook out and your pen, and you're in that mind of, oh, I am ready to learn, or I'm ready to hate my life, depending on who you are. That might seem like it's all mundane, but that's a stage, and that's a stage that you helped set up. Did Drexel set up the chalkboard? Did Drexel set up the desks? Yes, of course, but you're the one that came in that outfit that you wore. You're the one that came and brought your notebook and or your laptop, and you're the one that is writing in your notebook or your laptop and participating and currently acting in that set. That's a set. That's a place designed for a certain type of communication. And I think it's extremely obvious to compare that to Disneyland. Now, Disneyland does, in fact, call themselves front stage or backstage. I was a cast member for Walt Disney World. I can confirm that. And I will tell you, the front stage is Beautifully said. Disney has a lot of teams that are dedicated to make sure that what guests see are pretty. And I do think that it is very admirable because in a stage, you're only looking at a 2D perspective. Can the stage have, layers to it? Oh, yes, of course. But you're looking at one thing versus Disneyland, the whole 360 point of view is your stage. So the ground has to look nice. The shrubberies and the plants have to look nice. Of course, the buildings have to look nice, but even the sides of the buildings. And fun fact about the Magic Kingdom in Orlando, Florida, it's actually a no-fly zone because, yeah, even the sky has to look nice, and they don't want people flying airplanes with advertisements in the sky. So literally, 360 degrees of view is the stage. Getting back to Goffman here, we may take the term personal front to refer to the other items of expressive equipment, the items that we most intimately identify with the performer himself, and that we naturally expect will follow the performer wherever he goes. As part of personal front, we may include insignia of office or rank, clothing, sex, age, and racial characteristics, size and looks, posture, speech patterns, facial expressions, bodily gestures, and the like. I think this is an interesting discussion because obviously you're going to be making rash judgments on people when you first see them. If you see a guy wearing stitched Greek letters and a backwards baseball cap, frankly, you might think that he's not the nicest person ever. Those are rash decisions and judgments that you are making. And yes, sometimes I do wear that outfit. I think it's interesting when we apply this to Disneyland, especially in the 21st century, where we are trying to make sure that every type of person can be represented. And I do believe this is a good thing. However, sometimes it doesn't really match up to the story we're trying to tell. I try to think of Liberty Square in Magic Kingdom, which is supposed to be colonial Philadelphia, and no offense to these cast members, I mean them no harm here, but people of color and cast members of color were not treated equally during those times. However, they should definitely be in costume if they want to be in Liberty Square. I am not saying that. I am saying, though, that it is an interesting concept when you think of Disneyland because Disneyland, first off, is a business and it needs to make sure that it has employees and it needs to make sure that it can run. But it's also going to want to make sure that their guests feel comfortable and see themselves in their cast members and their stories. And it's an interesting juxtaposition, and I think theater does this as well. There's things in life that we can't control. We can't control what color our skin is. We can't control what accent we grew up with. We can change our accent, but sometimes it's still going to slip out. And I think that it's very interesting, both in Disneyland and in real life, that these things will come with us and will come into the interactions that we have. We're always going to be putting on a front stage, yes, but these glimmers of real life still shine through. Welcome back to the Thrilling Sound Podcast. My name is Sawyer, and today we are still discussing communication theory, especially Goffman's front stage and backstage theory, and how it applies to our everyday life, and of course, everybody's favorite, Walt Disney World and/or Disneyland and/or whatever you want, the Walt Disney Company, especially the parks. Now that we're getting into the nitty and gritty, we can talk a little bit about backstage. A back region or backstage may be defined as a place relative to a given performance where the impression fostered by the performance is knowingly contradicted as a matter of course. There are, of course, many characteristic functions of such places. It is here that the capacity of a performance to express something beyond itself may be painstakingly fabricated. It is here that illusions and impressions are openly constructed. For our everyday lives, this is when we're getting ready in the morning. This is when we're brushing our teeth and picking out our outfit. That is the illusion we're trying to portray that morning. We're trying to portray that we're clean and hygienic. We're trying to portray that we're cool. Maybe we have a brand new t-shirt that we're very excited to show off. For Disney, on the other hand, this is where all the cast members are clocking into work and getting ready to go into customer service mode. This is the backstage of the actual performance of the fireworks show where you can see the giant animatronic dragon and you realize that it doesn't have a body. It's just the face and the wings. These are the things that other people aren't supposed to see. These are the illusions. I think directly to the Haunted Mansion when I hear that line. If you don't know, the Haunted Mansion is kind of a spooky but funny attraction. You sit in a doom buggy, ho, 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 and you go throughout this scary house. In one of the scenes, you're in a dining room, and there's a lot of these ghosts having a great dinner party, and they're shooting each other, and they're laughing, and they're dancing, and they're playing the piano, and they're having a great time. But all of a sudden you start to notice that these ghosts are disappearing and reappearing because they're ghosts. It's actually one of the oldest illusions in the book, and it's called Pepper's Ghost, and it's actually based on a mirror and where the mirror is and how it moves and how the animatronics move. And I'm not a mechanical engineer or a magician, but it is just delightful to watch, and especially delightful to watch once you know how it works. And it's still mesmerizing every time. I very highly, highly, highly suggest that you look into it. But you're not supposed to see that mirror, and you're not supposed to see that those animatronics are full animatronics. And that is the illusion of the backstage. And it's so magical to me because, as I talked about earlier, as I grew up and as I grew older and more mature, I realized that the engineering and the cast member themselves are the magic. The amount of work that people put into this park is the magic. And to me, seeing the backstage and understanding the backstage made me appreciate going even more. And I don't know if this Goffman theory invites us to do that. I especially think in today's world where we are obsessed with authenticity, I think we may have to update this theory. Although, I do want to get into when we fake backstage and we make the backstage front stage. I think we do this a lot in our everyday culture. I mean, look at the social media app Be Real. You know, everybody was like, oh, you have to be real in the moment, but then you're posing for that picture. And you're setting up your hair and you're setting up your background to make sure people don't think that you're messy, you know? And Disney does this too. As I said, Disney is a for-profit company. Especially when they're recruiting for new cast members, they make backstage look glamorous and glorious, and they tell you about all of the things that you get to do, and you get to be a part of the magic. Did I enjoy working for Disney? Yes, I did. Were there days where I felt like I was a part of the magic? Yes, of course. Were there days where I wished the magic would die? No, of course not. Disney, please hire me. But I think it's interesting if we could update this theory today and tell Goffman that today we're kind of obsessed with making the backstage presentable, which some might say would break this theory, but I think it even encourages it more. We're putting on a show of putting on the show. Yes. Is it Inception? Of course. Is it fun to think about? Yeah, I think so. And I think that theories and models should evolve. And I think that it's fun to poke at these theories and models. And I also think it's fun to talk about theme parks. So that's why we're here, you know? But getting back to the original theory, here's another quote about backstage. Here, costumes and other parts of personal front may be adjusted and scrutinized for flaws. Here, the team can run through its performance, checking for offending expressions when no one is present to be affronted by them. Here, poor members of the team who are expressively inept can be schooled or dropped from the performance. Here, the performer can relax. He can drop his front, forego speaking his lines, and step out of character. I like to think of this section of the theory in everyday life when you come home from your work and you come home from school. You know, I'll tell you my routine. I come home and I exchange my jeans for basketball shorts, and that's one part of my, my costume of trying to look put together. I try to wear jeans instead of basketball shorts, but as soon as I come home, I'm like, give me those basketball shorts now, please. And, sometimes I just have to sit on my bed or my desk or my chair and just like breathe and just not think about anything and process everything that happened throughout the day. For Disney, because they're so much like a theatrical company, this is kind of true as well. I remember being in the break room for Typhoon Lagoon, which is Disney's water park, and I was just soaking in that AC, especially in those Florida summers. And I was just trying to, make sure my face wasn't as flushed so I wouldn't look like I was dying on stage, where I would look like, I'm a responsible lifeguard and I can save you. And it says here that the character can relax. He can drop his front, forgo speaking his lines, and step out of character. And I think definitely that interaction is fun. And I think definitely that is applicable to Disney and being a Disney cast member. What's really fun is that when you have a lot of cast members go on break at the same time, and you're excited because you're all friends with them, and you have them all go on the break at the same time, and you can see as a cast member yourself, you can see all of their fronts drop and they just relax. And that's another interesting part of this theory is when we invite people into our backstage. I think about my girlfriend. I think about my mother. Like, I think about people that have seen my backstage and I don't try to put on a front for them. And it's kind of nice because you can get that backstage relief, but you also can still get interaction. And I think that's something that this theory also doesn't really talk about much when we let people into our backstage. Here's the last quote that we can delve into. Since the vital secrets of a show are visible backstage, and since performers behave out of character while there, it is natural to expect that the passage from front region to back region will keep closed to members of the audience, or that the entire back region will be kept hidden from them. This is a widely practiced technique of impression management. I think a lot of people in this life keep their backstage hidden. I think of my father, my Irish Catholic father, who grew up in Ireland. He is very much, I'll keep everything buried and it'll die with me the day that I die. And he doesn't want people to know what his opinions and what his emotions are because that's for him and that's for him only. And I do respect that. And I think a lot of people in this life, especially older people, especially more traditional people, are like that. Do I think everybody's like that? No, of course not. I don't think I'm like that. And I think a lot of Disney is like that as well. I think about the fact that when Disney has a parade, and the parade is going into the backstage area, the dancers still have to do their choreo in the backstage area just in case a kid peeks his head around the fence and looks into that backstage. Because the parade is never supposed to end. It's supposed to be a fun and happy time. There's a section of people doing their choreography that nobody except for cast members can see. But they have to do it until you are absolutely 1,000,000,000% sure that no guest is in view. Because you can't ruin that magic. And it is vital to that parade that the dancers keep dancing and keep having fun. And I think that's very interesting, and I think the reason that I am so drawn to Disney, not because I was a theater kid growing up or anything, is the balance of back and front stage, is the mesmerizing ability of the cast members to make mundane things feel so grand. And I think Goffman would appreciate that too. And I think that it's very, very, very interesting that he was developing this theory while Walt himself was developing the perfect analogy for his theory. I want to thank you guys for listening to this one. I know it's very philosophical and kind of different than the last two podcasts that I did, but I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I think maybe you can go into the parks and appreciate the work that the cast members do, but maybe you could also appreciate yourself more, and maybe let that front stage drop a little bit, maybe be more authentic to people, or enjoy the work that you put into it. You're your own person, and I hope that you guys enjoyed listening to this, because I know I definitely enjoyed talking about it, and I can talk about it for a while. Well, as I said, I've been Sawyer, and this has been the Thrilling Sound Podcast. Thank you for listening.